So lesson 4, which is the last lesson of chapter 7, will be about gas exchange, and we're talking about CO2 and oxygen here, about the control of respiration, and a little bit about the disorders that can exist in your respiratory system. So the first thing that we will talk about is this idea of internal respiration. In other words, how gases are being transported in your blood, so from your lungs to your cells or from your cells to your lungs via your blood. Now I have a little picture here, and I'm going to illustrate each part of it sort of one piece at a time. I made a picture rather than writing a bunch of words because I thought it better represented the fact that this is a cycle that's happening. So the first thing that I'll point out is that we're going to say that the lungs are in this space right here. Obviously they're not drawn, and obviously this picture is not an anatomical representation of what your blood vessels look like. But on the top we have lungs, and on the bottom, in this space here, is where your tissues. So that would be the cells of your body that need oxygen brought to them, and the cells of your body that are making CO2. A good example would be a muscle cell, because they are doing a lot of cellular respiration, but it could realistically be any tissue in your body. So we're going to focus on how gases are getting from your lungs to your cells, and from your cells back to your lungs. On the right side of the picture, we have arteries. Now, arteries are usually red on pictures because they have oxygen in them. That's typically how they are represented. On the left side, we have veins. Veins are typically blue in pictures because they have low oxygen. I try not to say that they have no oxygen because that's probably not very realistic, but they have low oxygen. So usually what we say when we talk about veins is that they are deoxygenated. That means they had oxygen and oxygen got taken away. So obviously on the right side of the picture, we're going to focus on oxygen. I'm not saying that there's no carbon dioxide in your arteries. We're simply focusing on the main method of transport. So on the right, we're going to talk about how oxygen is transported. So you can see over here that oxygen is coming in to your arteries. This oxygen diffuses in to the plasma of your blood. Approximately 1% of the oxygen that your lungs bring in goes into the plasma of your blood. Now, plasma is the liquid, so water part of blood. So there is always a little tiny bit of oxygen in the liquid part of your blood. Now the next structure shows us that most of the oxygen, 99% of it, instead of staying in the plasma of your blood, gets attached to a structure. Now this structure is a circle with 4 sections, and in each of the sections it says Fe. So this is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein. It's a protein whose function is to transport something. So we saw hemoglobin as an example, like in lesson 3 of unit 1, we talked about what some of the functions of proteins are. There are 4 parts, each with iron which is Fe as its chemical symbol. So the circle with 4 sections with Fe in each section is representing iron. And then you can see that on each of the 4 sections, there is an oxygen attached. So the iron's job is to attract and bind oxygen. Now this is how the other 99% of oxygen is transported in your blood, is on this protein called hemoglobin. So for the most part, oxygen is not just flying around loose, it's attached to a protein, and this protein is transporting it around in your blood. Now when oxygen leaves your blood, it's not just going anywhere. Very often it is going to a protein. The example on this particular picture is that if your oxygen was going to a muscle, the protein it would get attached to is myoglobin, because that's the protein in your muscles that binds oxygen. Now, is it important to know exact numbers? Not really. It's important to know that most of the oxygen is transported by hemoglobin and a very small amount is by diffusion. This isn't something that I would ask as a numeric response question because those are just really vague average numbers and it would be different at different times of the day for different people. But I would expect you to know which one transports most of it and which one does only a little bit. So that's the oxygen side. That's going from your lungs towards your tissues. Most of the oxygen is attached to hemoglobin. Now when we arrive at your tissues, we know that at this point, cellular respiration happens. So whatever oxygen your cells or your tissues had, they're going to use it and they are going to produce CO2. So now we're focused on how does CO2 get into your blood. Now for CO2 there are actually 3 different ways that it can be transported. The first way, that's 7%, is the idea of diffusion into plasma. So much like for oxygen, some of the CO2 can just be in the liquid part of your blood, just hanging out. Now, contrary to oxygen, hemoglobin is not the main method of transport. You'll see that we have a circle. The circle has 4 sections, each with iron in it. So it is still the same molecule, but we're going to call it something different. We're going to call it Carb, Amino, Hemoglobin. Now I left spaces there so that you could see the sections of the word, but it's actually all just one big long word. The carb part refers to carbon. The amino part refers to some nitrogen and hydrogen. So the carbon dioxide that's in your blood will attach to some nitrogen and some hydrogen, and then attach to hemoglobin. So, hemoglobin does not only transport oxygen, it can also transport CO2. It is not the main method of transport for CO2, but it is possible. Now the main method of transport for CO2, the one that has 70%, is this ion, which is called bicarbonate. We already saw bicarbonate. It was one of the things that got reabsorbed in your excretory system. Now, how does bicarbonate get made? Very basically, when CO2 and water mix and react with each other, we end up getting, through a series of reactions, the bicarbonate ion. This is the main way that CO2 is transported, which makes sense because your blood is mostly made up of water anyways. So there's lots of water to react with the CO2. Now you might ask yourself, hey, I thought that my kidneys were reabsorbing bicarbonate, but bicarbonate seems to be the way that CO2 hangs around. Why on earth would I want to keep bicarbonate? Bicarbonate plays a role in pH balance. The way that you get bicarbonate is really by creating an acid out of CO2 and water. And so bicarbonate is useful to help maintain the pH balance, as well as hydrogen ion balance and a bunch of other things that your body has as well. And then eventually, when we get back to your lungs, CO2 will leave your blood so that you can exhale it out of your lungs. So what's happening at your lungs is external respiration. What's happening in your tissues is cellular respiration. And this picture illustrates internal respiration. How did the gas get from your lungs to your cells, or from your cells back up to your lungs? Now, is there anything about internal respiration that anybody would like to ask about here? Just like with oxygen, I wouldn't expect you to know the exact percentages for carbon dioxide. I would expect you to know that bicarbonate is the #1 way, the carb-amino hemoglobin is #2, and diffusion into plasma is #3. But the exact number wouldn't be something I would put in a numeric response. So the next thing we have to talk about has a lot to do with bicarbonate. That's why I left it to the very last thing. Bicarbonate, aside from being the way that CO2 is transported, is one of the ways that your brain knows when you are supposed to breathe and how much you are supposed to breathe. So our next little section is about the regulation of breathing. Now there's a picture here just for illustrative purposes. Perhaps you don't want to draw the entire thing because I'll talk about what is going on. First thing you should know is that when you breathe, it can be both voluntary and involuntary. Involuntary, if you remember, means automatic. You are not in charge of it. It happens all by itself. You also know that if you think about it, you have some degree of control over your breathing. You cannot control it all the time. At a certain point, your brain would take over even if you were trying to use voluntary control. But what we're going to really discuss is the involuntary part. We've already discussed the voluntary part where you contract your muscles. This is the part that happens in your brain. So there are chemo receptors. So look at the word in two parts. It's something that is receiving a chemical substance. These receptors are in the medulla oblongata, which is a part of your brain. So in this middle part of your brain here, there's sort of a little stem that attaches the big bulky part of your brain to your spinal cord. And if we were to take that part and make it larger, we would see a bunch of structures. And this thing here that is long and in the middle is your medulla oblongata. So medulla means in the middle, oblongata means it's oblong, like a long oval shape. So the name is really just telling you what it looks like. So this is a part of your brain. This part of your brain, which we call the brainstem, is where a lot of automatic things are controlled. So things like the fact that your eyes blink and that your heart beats and that you breathe are all controlled in this section. So there are receptors there that are receiving signals about carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ions. So, the link here is that CO2 plus water makes an acid, which in turn makes bicarbonate. If there is an acid, then we should be able to detect hydrogen ions. Now, I'm not expecting you to know the chemistry that goes along with it, so I'm trying to be as general as I can here. But the idea is that your brain is detecting how much CO2 there is. So there are receptors that are sensitive to CO2 and hydrogen. And then there are receptors in a bunch of other places in your body as well. This is representing a blood vessel. This is representing other parts of your brain. This is representing your lungs. And then on the bottom here, this is representing your muscles. So all of these things are sending signals to your medulla. And the signal they're sending is about how much CO2 and how much hydrogen there is, and what's going on in your lungs and your muscles. Now we're going to focus on the concentration part, concentration of CO2 and hydrogen. If the concentration of these two chemicals in the blood increases, then your medulla signals to your diaphragm to contract. So, you might try at some point in your life to hold your breath for as long as you can. And the point where you stop being able to hold your breath is where this automatic involuntary control takes over. The concentration of CO2 would be too high in your blood, and your brain would be forcing your diaphragm to move so that you start breathing again. So this is why it's really difficult to hold your breath or to die from holding your breath. Now you can die from other things related to breathing, but holding your breath usually isn't one of them, because at a certain point all of these receptors are sending signals saying, nope, sorry, you have to breathe. We don't care that you're trying not to breathe. You have to. So that's how breathing is controlled with your brain. Does anyone want to ask any questions about your medulla? So we'll take our little pause here.